of July is right around the corner, and I love to have patriotic decorations in my home. I've gathered up all of my red, white, and blue craft supplies, and I have 5 projects that are really fun that I'm excited to share with you. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Jess, and I love to make home decor on a budget. And if you do too, then let's get started. Sometimes I get asked what I do with all of the projects I create, and for the most part I use them or I give them away to family and friends, but sometimes I repurpose them. I have 2 of these tag signs from Easter that I had painted one time for a project, and I also have some wooden letters that spell out USA and a wooden star that I'm just going to use for a pattern. Now, I already took all the embellishments off of these 2 tags, but there is some residual glue left over, so I'm just using my sanding block to get all of that glue off before I move on to painting them. I wanted to turn these 2 tags into one big sign, so I lined them up with the bottoms together. I used a little piece of painter's tape to hold it in place, and then I cut down a larger craft stick so that I could hot glue it over the seam of where the 2 signs meet. I used some of the Dollar Tree spackling and a leftover piece of craft stick, and I ran it along the seam between the 2 signs just to make it a little smoother. After the spackle had dried, I took my favorite chalk paint, the Plaster Color by Waverly, and I gave my new sign 2 coats of this paint. Then I moved on to my wooden letters, and I'm using the Crimson paint by Waverly, and I gave each of these letters just 1 coat. Whenever I'm doing craft projects, I try to plan out what all needs painted first, so that way I can set everything aside to dry while I move on to everything else. I only had 1 of these wooden stars, but I needed 3 of them altogether, so I decided just to take a scrap piece of cardboard, and I traced out 3 stars on the cardboard and cut them out with my utility knife. I found this scrapbook paper at Joann Fabrics, and I thought it would be perfect for this sign, and all 3 of my stars actually fit on 1 piece of paper, so I laid my stars out and traced them and cut them out. I did mark on the cardboard and the paper where the top of each star was before I cut it out. That way I could line them up better once I needed to glue the scrapbook paper onto the front of the star. Because these were traced from a pattern and I cut them by hand, some of the points were a little bit longer than others, and the stars weren't exactly symmetrical with each other, so it just helps that I marked them so that it made it easier to line the paper up. And I always like to use this art glitter glue anytime I'm using scrapbook paper because I think it has a really quick hold, but it doesn't warp the paper like Mod Podge can. So I just added a thin layer of that, and then I lined my scrapbook paper star up on my cardboard star. To hide the edge of the stars where you could still see the cardboard, I took some of this thin macrame cord that I got from Amazon. I'll make sure that it's linked in the description box below. And I just ran a bead of hot glue along all the edges of the stars, and I outlined all of them with this macrame cord. Now that the paint is dry on all of my wooden letters, I could hot glue 1 letter to the center of each of the stars. Before adding all of the embellishments to my sign, I decided that I wanted it to have more of a distressed look, so I'm using some of the Mineral Color by Waverly, and I'm just dry brushing around the edges of the sign and through the center a little bit. Now, some places in the center I felt like I had just a little too much of the mineral color, so I went back through with my sanding block and just sanded it off to reveal more of that white through it. I could still see where the 2 tags had met in the center, so I used that as my guide to know where to place my center star. I glued that one down first, and then I just eyeballed the other 2 on either side of that one and spaced them out as even as I could. I wanted to create some scrappy bows for either side of my sign, so I gathered up a bunch of ribbons that I had in my stash that were either red and white, blue and white, or just red and blue. I just gathered up everything that I thought looked good together. I cut a bunch of pieces of ribbon down to about 5-inch lengths, and then I either dovetailed the ends of the ribbons or I just cut them into a point. Once I had all my ribbons prepared, I laid them down in an X pattern on my work surface, and then I just cinched them in the middle and tied them with another piece of string. I got this cute set of wooden beads from Amazon that are all patriotic themed, and one of the beads is a star shaped, so I hot glued that to the center of each of my bows. Before gluing my bows onto my sign, I wanted to create the hanger for the sign first. So I strung some jute twine through the left-hand side of the sign, and then I strung on a bunch of those patriotic wooden beads that I had told you about, and then I tied the string to the other side of the sign. To finish off my sign, I just hot glued a bow to each side. Here's a better look at those wooden beads that I was talking about that I got from Amazon. In addition to these, I'm also going to use some of these Wicker Stars that I got from Amazon and that Macrame Cord again. And then I found this really cool bundle of ribbon from Michaels that had all different kinds of patriotic ribbon in it. And I'm going to create a really fun garland. I started by looping one end of my garland over and attaching it with some hot glue, and then I took this thinner cord that I had on hand, that's actually from the Dollar Tree, and I just wrapped it around several times to give those raw edges a finished look. One of the elements of my garland is going to be a ribbon tassel, and the ribbons in that bundle were about 3 feet long, so I laid them out in an S pattern so that each length would be about 12 inches. I gathered them up and I tied them in the center with another piece of that cord from the Dollar Tree, and then about 3/4 of an inch down from the top of where I had tied it, I tied another piece in place. I trimmed off the bottom lengths on the tassel so that all of those loops were cut and everything was the same length. Then I took another piece of ribbon from that pack and I just hot glued it around the cord at the top to give it a finished look. For the second element on my garland, I'm using those Wicker Stars, and I strung some of that thinner cord from the Dollar Tree through the top. I hot glued the two ends together, and then I was able to string on a few of those patriotic beads. Unfortunately, I forgot to hit record before I tied everything onto the macrame cord, but I'll show you what I did anyway. I laid my ruler out and I started with one of the stars. I tied it on and then I measured about 4 inches down and I tied the next thing on. Now when I tied them on, I made sure that they were pretty snug but loose enough that I could still slide them back and forth on that macrame cord so that I could adjust everything once it's hung. In April, my husband and I were out of town, and one of the Dollar Trees I stopped at had a Dollar Tree Plus section, and I found this really cute wicker wreath. I didn't care for the foam starfish that were on it, but I knew I could customize it to how I liked it. After I popped off all those foam starfish, I grabbed some white flowers out of my stash, and I just placed them in the spaces where the starfish used to be. I wanted to create a big loopy bow for the top of my wreath. I started with the widest ribbon that I had and I measured out 12 inches in length and I looped it over on itself until I had 3 loops on each side. I repeated that again with my second color, but this time I measured it out to be 10 inches wide, and I did the same thing where I looped it over on itself until I had 3 loops on each side. I did that again one more time with a third color, but this time I only measured 6 inches wide before I started looping it over on itself. I found the center of each of my bundles and I just cut a slit in about 1/4 of an inch on each side. I like to use pipe cleaners when I'm creating bows, so I started with the smallest of the bundles of ribbon and I added that in, making sure that I fished the pipe cleaners through the slits on each side of the bundles, and when I had all 3 of them stacked together, I just pinched them in the middle and then tightened up my pipe cleaners. Then I got to work on fluffing out all of my loops. This is a never-ending process for me because I always fluff it once and then after I add it to my project I keep fluffing, and it seems like every time I walk past it in my living room now I fluff the bows a little more, and that's okay. Once I was done with the first round of fluffing of the bow, I used the pipe cleaner that was still attached on the back and I just ran that through the top of my wreath and tightened it on. I took the red and blue stars out of that pack of Wicker Stars and I just hot glued them here and there around the wreath itself to fill in any little gaps. if you are liking these patriotic decor pieces so far, please show me by giving this video a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. If you're on social media, I am on Instagram at GlueLaLa, so you can come follow me over there. Now let's get into the last two projects. Every time I'm at the Dollar Tree, I just can't pass up any little wooden houses that they might have. I gathered up 3 that I already had in my stash, and I decided to give them a patriotic twist. I popped the back off of this shadow box house, and then I used the plaster color again, and I dry brushed around all the edges of all 3 houses. I gathered up 3 coordinating scrapbook papers that I liked that were very patriotic. I traced 1 house on each piece of paper, and then I cut them out, and I used that art glitter glue again to adhere them to each of the houses. If there was any scrapbook paper hanging over the edges of the houses, I just used my sanding block in a downward motion over the edges to take off the excess. I reattached the back of the shadow box house with some hot glue, and then I was able to move on to the embellishments. I felt like the tallest of the houses needed a roof. I grabbed some of these giant craft sticks from Walmart. I cut them down to fit over the top of the house with about a 1/2 inch of an overhang. And I also cut down a piece of a barbecue skewer, and I painted them all with the crimson color by Waverly. I ran a bead of hot glue along each side of the tallest of the houses to attach my craft stick to be the roof. And then I used that small piece of a barbecue skewer, and I glued that along the top to help fill in the gap between the 2 craft sticks. I also hot glued one of those Wicker Stars to the top of this house, and as you can see here, this would also make a great start to a Christmas craft as well. Next, I added hot glue to the back and the bottom of the medium-sized house, and I tucked it right up under the roof of the larger house. For the smallest of the houses, I grabbed some of this red and white baker's twine that I had, and I wrapped it around the center several times. After I tied a bow off to the one side, I took 2 of those smaller blue wooden beads from that pack, and I just added them to the tails of the bow. I added hot glue to the bottom of this small house, and I layered it on top of the other 2 houses. I grabbed a piece of this patriotic ribbon, and I cut one of the edges of the wire off, and then I cut the rest of the ribbon into triangle shapes. I took those triangle shapes and I hot glued them onto another piece of that red and white baker's twine to make a pennant garland to fit over top of the second house. I hot glued one edge of the garland to the roof of the largest house, and then I just draped it down over till I liked how it looked, and I hot glued it on the other side of the middle house. As a final embellishment, I tied a simple shoestring bow out of some blue and white gingham ribbon that I had, and I just hot glued it to the base of that wicker star at the top. Around Easter time, the Dollar Tree had these really cute galvanized buckets that had little spring and Easter scenes on them. I had one left over in my stash, and I decided to paint it so I could make a patriotic flower display. I took some of this nautical colored chalk paint by Folk Art, and I was really careful to make sure that I didn't paint the lips at the bottom and the top of the bucket, and also the handle of the bucket. I wanted those to stay the metallic color, but I did have to give this entire bucket 2 full coats of this blue color. This set of window clings from the Dollar Tree is so cute, and it has such a cute farmhouse vibe to it. I grabbed the one off of here that looks like a wreath that says USA in the center, and I just used a little Mod Podge to adhere it to the front of my bucket. I added some floral foam inside my bucket, and since I had painted mine blue, I decided to stick with just red and white flowers for the flower arrangement part, and I did add in a bunch of greenery as well. To add some height to my flower arrangement, I took 2 more of those barbecue skewers and I hot glued them to the base of these wicker stars that I had in that pack. Then I tied some simple bows out of some red and white striped ribbon, and I hot glued that to the base as well. I cut the skewers down a bit and then I tuck them into my flower arrangement. Now, if you guys have been with me for a while, you know I don't always feel very confident in my flower arranging skills, but I think this one turned out pretty good. Thanks for hanging out and crafting with me today. Let me know what kind of plans that you have for the 4th of July. We'll probably be at a cookout at my parents' house. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.